Gaining freedom from health debt is really what this podcast and greatmed.org is all about. Putting power in your hands to improve your God-given ability to be healthy. Many people with preventable disease want to make lifestyle changes. They want to improve or reverse disease, but they don't know how. Walk, Don't Run to the Doctor is the resource hub that is a cure for a common confusion about healthy living. Welcome back to Walk, Don't Run to the Doctor. And today's episode is filmed at our town hall that we did for osteoporosis, trying to help people realize all the things they can do to make their body have stronger bones and fewer fractures. So we're going to be talking about osteoporosis and preventing fractures. And everywhere we're talking about, remember that the issue of preventing fractures is more important than the issue of osteoporosis. We're not trying to treat a number on a piece of paper, but often that's all we've got, so we do. But remember the weakness of that. What we really want to do is prevent fractures. We're going to be touching very briefly on drug treatment, but this is not a talk about drug treatment of osteoporosis. We'll talk about diet quite a bit, nutritional supplements, and that's where some of you may be fairly disturbed because I'm going to say they basically don't work. And then I'm handing over to the people who really know about exercise to take it away with the rest of this. So. Osteoporosis, the definition can vary, but most of you are probably familiar with DEXA scanning to identify bone density. We can use just plain old fracture history. If you've broken lots of major bones, you've probably got osteoporosis, regardless of what our tests show. And then there's this thing called the FRAX score, which is a calculation based on a number of factors from Sheffield University that tries to estimate what your risk of fracture is. And so these are all different pieces of information we can bring in to play. The problem with bone mineral density is it doesn't talk about all kinds of morphologic features of bone that contribute to the strength of the bone. And so it can be misleading. And you can make, for example, I could substantially increase the bone density of any of you right now in months with fluoride. And your fracture risk would go up, not down. And so what I'm trying to help everybody appreciate is that don't be too buffaloed by numbers. Medicine often tries to make things really simple because it makes our life easier if we can just follow a simple algorithm and not have to deal with the realities of life. But you have to deal with the realities of your life, so don't assume anything and don't trust anybody, including me. So if you have a concern about something I say, yell at me. So DEXA scanning is a imperfect tool, but often it's the only one we've got, so we still use it. We're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it doesn't, for example, take into account the remodeling and reshaping that occurs with load bearing, with exercise and appropriate diets and so on. And it doesn't take into account things like elasticity. So if you have a relatively thin bone, but a very strong protein structure with lots of elasticity, then you're probably not going to break, you're going to bounce. And so it's those kind of factors that we don't have a way of measuring. Well, you can fall down, and that tells us a little bit. But there's so many unknowns that's important for you to keep in mind. And so never lose focus on the goal, that the goal is reducing fracture risk. And things like keeping your height up so you can look down on me. Back deformities. All of you, I'm sure, have seen plenty of people who are substantially disabled in life simply because vertebral fractures have led them to have unable to stand up straight. And those are just awful. Broken bones, but especially broken hips. And we'll often emphasize broken hips tonight because a substantial number of people with a broken hip die in the next 6 months. Sometimes you could almost call it a pre-terminal event. And for those of you who have broken a hip and are still hale and hearty, as many of you probably are here, then don't take that comment too seriously. But it's a substantial marker of frailty. We'd like to minimize pharmaceutical side effects and cost. We'd like to improve overall health and quality of life, not just bone health. And this last line highlights the difference between pharmaceutical medicine and lifestyle medicine, and we're all about lifestyle medicine. But that doesn't mean that we don't use pharmaceutical medicine every chance we get. just some of the risk factors for osteoporosis that's preventable. We've got, if you don't send your kids out to play and you don't feed them enough protein and greens and things, then, or if they get eating disorders, things like that, then they're not going to develop peak bone mass that they should. And that's a problem because people get peak bone mass maybe 35, 40 years old, something like that, and then you tend to start losing it a little bit. And that's okay if you start with enough bone mass. And so I'm going to emphasize in a few minutes the idea that pay attention to our kids and help them develop bones and muscles that count. Lower muscle mass, restrictive diets, including vegetarian and vegan diets, are associated with more osteoporosis and fractures. And any other cause of malnutrition. And it's probably, some of you probably think it's unkind of me to refer to vegetarian and vegan as malnutrition. But if you look at bone health, I think you have to see it that way. But celiac disease, almost any Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, gastrointestinal surgeries, there's lots and lots of reasons why somebody may not be absorbing nutrients enough. There's a whole bunch of diseases that can cause low bone mass and fractures. Hyperparathyroidism is one of the more common ones that we see. Medications, corticosteroids, that's what we like to use. Corticosteroids in as low a dose and as short a time as we can. And always be thinking, can we stop this drug or reduce the dose? Sedentary lifestyle. The great thing about a sedentary lifestyle is you can sit on a couch and you're probably not going to break your ankle, but you're going to get weak bones and die anyway. So, and then any cause of poor balance and falls is strictly speaking not a risk factor necessarily for osteoporosis, but it's definitely a risk factor for fractures. So maintaining, and sometimes we suggest that a patient go down who isn't sufficiently impressed by my suggestion that they eat right and exercise. We often suggest that they go down to the lobby of the hospital and just spend 5 or 10 minutes looking at some of the older people walking through and say, do I want to be like that person with a straight back and a jaunty step? Or do I want to be that person on a walker? And they're both 85 years old, but one has a good quality of life and one of them doesn't. So we already talked about helping your kids. Play outside, sunlight's important. Eat well, build muscle mass. And in so doing, you'll build muscle mass and you're going to change the trajectory of their entire health. Plus, by being a good example yourself, you're going to change their habits. And they're going to start off with a real deposit in their health account that nothing else can give them. It's really interesting for somebody who's by nature a bit of a slug like me. I'm delighted to tell you that extreme endurance sports might be a risk factor for osteoporosis in some people. Because the idea of running for 26 miles or 50 miles or something just is awful to me. But so we feel very justified in our sluggishness. So a question we often get asked is, so if I have osteoporosis or osteopenia, and I'm not going to define those terms more, we can talk about that if you want, then can they be reversed? And the answer is we don't know we can't give a global answer because it depends on the person and why they're where they are. But we routinely see people reversing their bone density loss with the kinds of steps that we're talking about today. Routinely, this is not unusual. But more importantly, we see these people with osteoporosis not getting fractures. And we can't measure that. You can't really measure a negative. But it's notable that the people who take great care of themselves just do really well, and we rarely see a fracture in that population. And so we like to look at food choices. We'll be talking about better balance and fall prevention that Connect will be talking about, increased muscle mass, and then that all leads to bone remodeling, bone strength, and elasticity. And everything that we can do to improve stability and reduce fall risk. And I apologize for commenting on this over and over again, but it's so important. And if any of you have older relatives, because I noticed none of you are older yourselves, but if any of you had older relatives, then doing things that improve their balance and ability to recover from a fall or a trip on a carpet is incredibly important. The things like, for example, ping-pong is probably the exercise that's best studied for preserving aging. And almost everybody who's getting older can do it, right? It's not even expensive. And so, so things like that are things that we need to, I think, promote in the older people older than you guys, and make it sort of part of our culture. Because I think it's unfortunate that you go to an endocrinologist or rheumatologist or an internist like me, and you get given a prescription for Lendronate or something, and you don't get a prescription for appropriate vigorous exercise and appropriate dietary change. So one of the things that we see in our consult cases is people who have gone to somebody, they have a DEXA scan that shows they've got osteoporosis, they get given a prescription for Lendronate, and that's it. Follow-up DEXA scan, a couple of years, check a vitamin D level maybe. When in actual fact, the diagnosis of osteoporosis is a big deal, and you should find out why you've got osteoporosis. You could almost call osteoporosis not a diagnosis. You could also cause it a symptom complex. And that's a little different way of looking at it. But you should be able to say to your doctor, why do I have osteoporosis? And if he or she says, I don't know, but we've done all the appropriate tests, that's a pretty good answer. We're not going to find out the answer every time. But don't simply take a drug and call it good. And in case I come across as anti-drug, I do prescribe drugs for osteoporosis, so because I do come across as anti-drug sometimes. There's a whole bunch of drugs available. I won't go over them. But before somebody gives you a drug for your osteoporosis, find out, what is the known fracture risk reduction expressed as absolute risk reduction. If you don't know what these terms mean, if you're seeing a doctor and getting treated by something, you should learn what these terms mean. It's not complicated. It's easier than some of the stat classes you took in high school. And find out how well do they work in people like you. It's going to annoy your doctor. It annoys me when I get these questions because I have to look this stuff up. But it's the right thing to do. And then you say to yourself, when I look at the side effects list, and I look at the cost, and I look at the potential benefit, is this the right drug for me? And then you can make an informed choice. And the big one we like to have people talk about is what is the number needed to treat to prevent fracture? So if I give you a drug and I say, for every 100 people I treat for 5 years, I prevent 1 hip fracture, you might say, boy, if that's me, if that was a lottery ticket, I'll take it. Or you might say, this drug is mainly making me feel terrible. What else you got? But having a sense of how useful the drugs are is really helpful. And so now we're going to talk about diet. So the Mediterranean diet, why not vegetarian? Specific dietary components we'll touch on, the microbiome, alcohol, which in small amounts is actually beneficial for your bones, you'll be delighted to know. Prunes and tea and coffee. And people laugh when we talk about prunes and we think that's wrong. So people use the term plant-based diets. And we would argue that the Mediterranean diet is the original plant-based diet. You add things like dairy and eggs and meat to it. And we would also submit that the Mediterranean diet and other omnivorous diets. So the Mediterranean diet is the one that's been studied the best. But if you look at similar diets, DASH is probably another one that's been studied very, very well. But these omnivorous diets, and you can see it in all of the big epidemiologic studies like Nurses' Health Study and so on, these consistently show improvements in health outcomes across the entire spectrum of human health. Mental health, dementia, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, bone loss. And so that's we'll talk about some specific studies. So in both large observational trials, where most of this data comes from, as well as randomized control trials like PREDIMED, we see a consistent finding with the Mediterranean diet of fewer fractures, including 29% lower risk of hip fracture. This is from a meta-analysis with 500,000 people with 15-year follow-up. Show me anything else that's associated with almost a 1/3 reduction in hip fracture risk with no cost, no toxicity, and multiple beneficial side effects. you're going to be looking hard. Some of the drugs would get in this territory, but at cost and potential side effects, and without all the beneficial side effects of a Mediterranean-style diet. It's also been shown to reduce the osteoporosis at almost every other spot that's been studied in the body, and it helps maintain muscle mass, which, for all we know, might be just as important as the improvement in bone density. But I think it's fair to say the Mediterranean diet is the only diet that in large studies has been shown to reduce not just osteoporosis, but also fractures. And just briefly, it's a self-serving comment. My sister and I wrote the book, Good Food, Great Medicine, which is now in its 4th edition, and happens to talk quite a bit about the Mediterranean diet, you'll be pleased to know. And so as a public service announcement, it involves vegetables and whole fruit, beans and legumes, and raw nuts and seeds. This is all sounding pretty ordinary, right? Whole grains. Eating good fat, especially extra virgin olive oil. Daily animal proteins and are part of the Mediterranean diet in most analyses. And then probiotic foods, and we'll talk about why some of these are important. Protein, especially as we get older, maintains muscle mass better and bone mass better. And as people get older, we often see the protein dropping off, and dramatically more so in a institutionalized population. But even in home, people just don't seem to want to bother with protein as much, and we really encourage you not to let that happen. As you get older, which is going to happen in years to come, then make sure you keep the protein up, and we would submit having some with every meal is a really good plan. Calcium. We're going to be talking about calcium, but especially dairy calcium. But we have options for people that don't tolerate dairy. B12, vitamin D, and we're going to be touching briefly on sunlight, which is probably going to drive some people crazy. I was speaking at a longevity conference a while back, and the dermatologist was talking about how dangerous sunlight was, and she was about 40 years old and just had gorgeous skin. And then the geriatrician was talking about dementia and aging and stuff. And so I said, while the dermatologist was still there, I said, well, tell me about sunlight, because I was going to be speaking next, and I was talking about sunlight. And the geriatrician said, oh, thanks for bringing it up. It's so important for healthy aging. And it was really interesting because the dermatologist didn't say anything. But we'll be talking about how important sunlight is for healthy aging. Vitamin K. And probiotic foods. And I don't have alcohol on that list, but we'll get there. In contrast, vegetarian diets are associated with more osteoporosis. And the osteoporosis increased, especially at the lumbar spine, so you lose height and you start bending. Risk ratio is relatively high for this kind of study. And the longer you're on the diet, the worse it gets. We might be able to blunt it. But with this might be one of the few places where calcium and vitamin D supplements actually help. But it's a little unclear. So I would plead with anybody who's promoting vegetarian diets is take a look at some of the mental health issues and things like osteoporosis and say, is this a healthy diet? Prunes. Believe it or not, people who eat prunes have stronger bones. Yeah, the trouble is nobody's ever done a study long enough to see if it reduces fracture risk. But we figure the risk-benefit ratio favors eating prunes. And the amount that gives measurable results are 4 to 10 a day. Coffee and tea. I feel like once or twice a week somebody comes in and they say, oh, you know, I've just got to get off my coffee or tea. Consumption has got to be bad for me. And I'm thinking, where do people get this idea? Is there a group of people out there that just want to make people miserable? Because coffee and tea are both consistently associated with better health outcomes, including things like less Parkinson's disease, important stuff. And so conversely, soft drinks are associated with higher rates of fractures. And we're not entirely sure why. A lot of it's associated with colas, and the phosphoric acid in colas seeming to be a factor. But there's so many reasons not to drink soft drinks, not to drink sweet drinks, whether they're artificially sweetened or sugar sweetened. It's just dumb. So if you have a healthy gut. So by healthy gut, it's got the fibers and the fats and the proteins and the bacterial and yeast critters hanging around in there that turn all those nutrients into things the body can use better. And one of the main classes, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, is something called short-chain fatty acids. And the short-chain fatty acids go everywhere in the body. They seem to turn off your appetite a little bit. They shut down cholesterol production. They improve immunity. They reduce cancer, the kinds of changes in cells that lead to cancer in numerous areas, but especially the colon. They have a favorable influence on bone health, blood sugar levels, heart disease risk, inflammatory levels, oxidation. So this mysterious organ we've got in the middle of us called the intestinal tract or the gut, we really should baby it. And the way you baby it is you give it whole food fiber, you give it whole food fats, not a low-fat diet. You eat probiotic foods, not little supplements with narrow ranges of bugs, because we don't know what bugs you need. That's part of the problem. And so anybody who's putting together a tablet or a capsule or a powder and says, hey, these are the bugs you need, they're making it up. And that's fine to make stuff up, but you really should tell your customers that you're making it up. Vinegar and wine, perhaps through the same mechanisms, improve the microbiome. Exercise improves the microbiome. I don't think we know why. And minimizing things like antibiotics and refined sugars that both distort the microbiome in a harmful way. Some of you are going to be irritated by this, and some of you are going to be delighted by it. So those of you who are delighted, don't show your delight too much. But light to moderate alcohol consumption is consistently associated with better spine and hip bone density. But if you go over 3 drinks a day, you're in trouble. And that applies, in alcohol, that applies to almost every bad thing with alcohol. Small amounts of alcohol preserve life, reduce your risk of heart disease and stroke in particular, reduce your risk of diabetes. Large amounts do everything bad you can imagine, including mess up your relationships. So a little bit of alcohol is good for your bones, a lot's not. Cook your own food. The data for ultra-processed foods, which basically means almost anything that comes from a factory. Your protein powders, anything that wasn't seen by your grandmother. So, great-grandmother. So your great-grandmother knew what canned beans were, right? And canned beans then and canned beans now are about the same. So they're the traditional methods of culturing meat, for example, like Olympic Provisions, who are not a sponsor, but I would be happy to invite the idea. Any of these traditionally preserved foods are okay. But in general, any of the foods made in a plant, and that includes things like bread, protein powders, protein bars, even the ones with earth tone labels and non-GMO. Remember, non-GMO junk food is still junk food. And so the interesting thing is you look at almost any aspect of health: heart disease, diabetes, mental health, dementia, obesity, stroke, and osteoporosis. And you can see in terms of the amount of these foods in the diet on a dose-related relationship, you can see the more people eat of these foods, the more of almost every disorder known to man they get. And why isn't this a prominent issue of discussion? So once again, going back to the person who's afraid of some potential little risk. You know, a recent example for Shelley was she was there's a group of people and there was a break and this person was describing while eating Oreo cookies from a package of Oreo cookies, was describing why everybody needed to have a charcoal filter on their shower head. And you know, maybe the case could be made for a charcoal filter to take chlorine out of your water in the shower. I mean, that's plausible actually, but compared to the Oreo cookies she was eating, you know, it's totally irrational. So try to, whenever you're thinking of threats to you, keep the threats in a sense that where the worst threat is labeled worse in your mind, and the lesser threat is labeled lesser. And that way you can concentrate on things like ultra-processed foods, because the only way to get around ultra-processed foods is cooking for yourself. And I don't think there's any easy way to talk about it, because some people just don't want to cook for themselves. It's inconvenient, it takes work, it gets in the way of other things they want to do. And, but if you do so, you'll save money, you'll save health problems, you'll put me out of business, and so on. You don't hear much from Michael Pollan now. I guess he's getting older, but he said something, and this isn't an exact quote, so I apologize, because I probably messed it up somehow. But a long time ago, about 20 years ago, he said, if it is a plant, eat it. If it's made in a plant, don't. And that's a pretty useful, but it means you pretty much have to make almost everything yourself. And so you can make it turn it into a social occasion with your friends. You can eat a lot of leftovers. There's all kinds of ways of approaching this. Calcium and vitamin D supplements. So basically, it would appear that calcium and vitamin D supplements don't work for bone health. Calcium and vitamin D in and of themselves are critical for bone health. So I'm not saying they're not important. I'm talking about supplements here. And so in general, remember that nutritional supplements are not natural. They're pharmaceuticals in almost every case. And I say almost every case only because I can't think of an exception, but I'm sure there's an exception out there. I just don't know ones. If you've got an idea, let me know. And so if you think of nutritional supplements as pharmaceuticals and the nutritional supplement industry is a less ethical arm of the pharmaceutical industry, I think you got it right. If they're pharmaceuticals, not food, it should not surprise you that they have different metabolic effects than food, because they're chemically different, and the cofactors that are present in food aren't present in a nutritional supplement, and we don't know what those cofactors should be. So calcium supplements by themselves don't reduce fractures, and by themselves, without vitamin D, there's actually a strong hint that they cause increase in heart disease. However, there's one subgroup of people that might benefit, and that's people in institutions. That's the only group where we have data that suggests that these are helpful. That's probably related to malnutrition kind of issues. And so calcium and vitamin D supplements together. So the research, there's calcium research, there's calcium vitamin D research, which is the dominant form, and then there's vitamin D by itself research. So calcium research there doesn't help. Calcium and vitamin D supplements do not improve bone density and do not reduce fracture risk in postmenopausal women. And these are all pretty major studies, incidentally. These are not fringe. And so this is a paper from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. And you may wonder, why is the Journal of the American College of Cardiology talking about calcium with respect to bone health? And the reason is this concern that calcium supplements cause heart attacks, which is still far from, but in this paper from a couple of years ago, they say, strive for calcium predominantly from food sources. And nobody would call JACC, a fringe journal. So if you want to get calcium from food sources, it's dairy, tofu made with calcium sulfate, green leafy vegetables, edamame, that's the soybeans, canned sardines, salmon, a bunch of other things. And we have a free lifestyle guide on this subject that tells you how to get enough calcium without any trouble. Incidentally, if anybody's really interested in this, the best papers on this subject of calcium are actually on the older papers. It's really hard to find really good recent papers, and these are two. This one in particular is it's in the European Journal of Endocrinology from about 7 years ago. And it's a pro-con paper. So it has one person saying calcium supplements are really good for you, and the other one saying calcium supplements kill you. And so you can really see all the data laid out from people who really know what they're doing. So vitamin D in the blood is really good for you. It reduces the risk of just about every disease known to man. Vitamin D is really important. If you give people vitamin D as a supplement, it doesn't seem to work. And we don't really know why. So if anybody wants this data, you can give us your email and we'll send you a copy of my slides, which also allows you to look up and see if the papers I'm quoting actually say what I say they do. That's actually not a bad thing to do when people are speaking. So I'm not going to go over all that. I'm not going to go over that either. In our labs, usually vitamin D is measured as nanograms per mil. And anything above 40 nanograms per mil oddly enough, you start seeing this trend towards higher total mortality, in other words, more dead bodies, and yet an improvement, significant improvement in some disease risks like cancer. So some of this data is really confusing. So we would argue 20 to 40 nanograms per mil is measured by our lab. Other labs use a different form of measurement. Is probably the sweet spot, but lots of people will give you different numbers. But of course, they're wrong and I'm right. And so how are you going to get vitamin D? You can get synthetic vitamin D, and I've already told you we have pretty good evidence that that doesn't work. You can use sunlight. You can use things like oily fish and cod liver oil. Grandmother knew about that. In fact, vitamin D was really discovered by mothers who found out that the kids who got out in the sun didn't get rickets in industrial England, and the kids that ate cod liver oil, which for some reason they were using, didn't get it either. And that led to the discovery of vitamin D. But first of all, mothers knew what made their kids better. Oh, and light exposed mushrooms. That's really weird. That's a Portland thing. So here's the papers. Vitamin D supplements don't decrease bone loss or fractures, and do not reduce fractures in community dwelling people. But just like calcium, it might help the institutionalized people. So if your grandmother is in a nursing home, then maybe it's worth doing. And I often get this question, well, if you're saying vitamin D supplements don't work, why do my doctors and naturopaths tell me that I got to take them and I'm going to die if I don't? And I hear this frequently. Well, Sir William Osler, who's one of the smartest doctors, possibly the smartest doctor to have ever lived, said the desire to take medicine is perhaps the greatest feature which distinguishes man from animal. So if you're not going to use synthetic vitamin D supplements, you can use sunlight. And we would say this is a good case for naked sunbathing, because the more square inches of sun you've got exposed, the more vitamin D you're going to make. And you probably have to make your vitamin D in summer, because you can, Michael Holick, who's the vitamin D guru, he was famous for lying in the snow naked in Boston, which is about the same latitude as us, and showing that an hour of sunlight at midday in Boston in winter does not make any vitamin D at all. So you have to do it in the winter. Oily fish and cod liver oil. So I have a tablespoon of cod liver oil about 3 times a week. It's kind of doable, and it's good for my dry eyes as well, in case you're wondering. But it's got... Straight or mix it with something? I take it straight. I don't want to spoil something else. So the question is, do I mix the cod liver oil with something else? Why would I mess something up with cod liver oil? So I just take it straight off the spoon. Anybody here have cod liver oil? Okay. With the lemon. Yeah. Yeah, lemony flavored. Yep. So we got some cod liver oil users here. It's not that bad, right? If you get eggs from chickens that are out in the sun, they have more vitamin D in them. And if you get battery chickens, they don't. Weight loss. For some reason, when our patients lose weight, their vitamin D levels shoot up. If you stick, so my wife Anna is back there, and if you come to our house sometimes at midday, you might see a cookie sheet filled with mushrooms, and those mushrooms are sitting in the sun, baking there and making vitamin D at absolutely no cost to us. The sunlight's free. And some people, because we recommend sunlight exposure, some people get excited about this because they think that we're going to kill them with skin cancer. In actual fact, people who deliberately have sun exposure in a non-burning way actually have lower death rates. And they live substantially longer. And the degree of benefit from sun exposure is similar to not smoking in terms of statistics. So it's kind of fascinating data. This even applies to people who have had a history of melanoma.
We're going to hear from some more people. Thank you, Miles.
Thank you. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and for more resources, go to greatmed.org.